I'm Gabriela Rodriguez, 30, female. I live in a small but cozy apartment in the city, a little sanctuary from the chaos of my job as a documentary film editor. My work involves sifting through hours of other people's lives, finding the thread of a story, and weaving it into something coherent and compelling. For the most part, my own life was a quiet rhythm of sorting through footage, sipping lukewarm coffee, and trying to piece together narratives that mattered. Little did I know, the most dramatic story I'd ever encounter wasn't on a memory card, but unfolding just a few doors down from my edit bay. It was a story of petty cruelty, corporate negligence, and a rescue mission that would turn our office upside down, forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. It started on a Tuesday, during the peak of a brutal summer heatwave that had clamped its jaws on the city for a week straight. The air outside shimmered, and the city felt like a giant open oven. Inside our glass and steel office building, the industrial, grade air conditioning was fighting a losing battle, whirring with a strained, mournful hum. The air was cool but stale, and a general lethargy had settled over everyone. Productivity had slowed to a crawl. People were sluggish, irritable, and counting the minutes until they could escape back into the inferno, if only because it was a different kind of suffering. I was deep in my element, a state of focus I can only achieve with my noise, canceling headphones on, blocking out the world. I was meticulously trimming an interview clip for a documentary about urban beekeepers. The man on screen was talking about the delicate ecosystem of the hive, the subtle communications, the way a colony can turn on its own. It was fascinating stuff. That's when I first heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping that seemed to cut through the audio I was editing. Tap, tap, tap. It was so faint, I thought it might have been part of the recording, some ambient sound the boom mic had picked up. I paused my work, pulling one side of my headphones off my ear. The low hum of the office filled the silence. The sound was gone. I scanned the room. A few colleagues were typing listlessly. No one seemed to have noticed anything. I dismissed it as the building settling, the pipes groaning under the strain of the heat, or some distant, phantom construction noise bouncing off the surrounding skyscrapers. I put my headphones back on and returned to the bees, but it happened again about an hour later, this time more insistent, more defined. Tap, 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 a short pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was a clear, deliberate pattern. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I took my headphones off completely and listened. It was real, and it sounded like it was coming from the back of the office, from the direction of the old archive rooms. That entire wing of the floor was a relic from a pre-digital age, a long, dim hallway lined with identical, heavy gray doors. Most of the rooms were empty now, filled with obsolete filing cabinets and forgotten office furniture. Nobody really went back there except for Mark Jenkins, our overbearing and deeply insecure department supervisor. Mark was a man who seemed to have peaked in middle management and had decided to make that tiny kingdom his entire world. He was 48, but he carried himself with the puffed-up authority of a general and the petulance of a spoiled child. The only other person I'd seen venture down that hallway recently was the new intern, Ben Carter. Ben was a quiet, almost painfully eager please kid, barely 22 years old and fresh out of college. He had that wide-eyed, slightly terrified look of someone who desperately wanted to make a good impression and was convinced he was one wrong move away from total failure. He was always trying to stay on Mark's good side, a task that seemed both impossible and deeply humiliating. Mark treated Ben less like an intern and more like a personal servant, assigning him menial, pointless tasks just to watch him scurry. He'd have Ben organize paperclips by size, fetch him coffee from a specific cafe 6 blocks away, or reform, add documents with margins that were off by a single millimeter. It was a constant, low-grade power trip. The tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. It was a weak, desperate sound. I felt a strange prickle of unease. I couldn't sit still. I got up, feigning a need to stretch my legs, and began a slow, meandering walk toward the archive hallway, trying to look as aimless as possible. The moment my sensible flats began to make soft, echoing sounds on the linoleum of the hallway, the tapping stopped, abruptly, as if the person making it had heard me coming. The hallway was even dimmer and stuffier than the main office. The air was thick and still. The doors were all closed, each with a small, tarnished brass number plate. The last one on the right, Archive 3, was the one Mark used for what he called overflow storage. In reality, it was a glorified closet, a windowless box filled with dusty stacks of old hard drives and obsolete equipment. I paused by the door, straining to hear anything. Silence. I put my ear to the cool metal, feeling a bit foolish, like a character in a spy movie. I heard nothing. No shuffling, no breathing, just the muffled hum of the building's ventilation system. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. Was I overthinking this? Was the heat getting to me? I told myself it was nothing. It was probably just a loose wire in the wall, or a pest, or any number of rational, boring explanations. I turned and walked back to my desk, the feeling of being a paranoid fool settling over me. But even as I tried to lose myself in my work again, the seed of unease had been firmly planted. The memory of that faint, deliberate tapping refused to fade. The next day, the city was trapped in the same suffocating grip. The weather forecast promised no relief, and the mood in the office had curdled from lethargy to outright misery. I saw Ben first thing in the morning. He was standing by the coffee machine, looking even more pale and drawn than usual. His shirt was already wrinkled and damp, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was fetching a coffee for Mark, who was standing by his own desk, arms crossed, watching him with an impatient, proprietary air. Ben gave me a quick, nervous smile as I approached, a fleeting glance of acknowledgement before his eyes darted back to Mark. He scurried away before I could even say good morning. Mark's lips curled into a smug, self-satisfied smirk as he took the coffee from Ben without a word of thanks. The interaction was brief, but it left a sour taste in my mouth. There was a dynamic between them that went beyond a typical boss-intern relationship. It felt predatory. Mark seemed to feed off Ben's anxiety, drawing energy from the kid's constant state of unease. I tried to push it aside and focus on my project, but the image of Ben's haunted eyes kept floating to the surface of my thoughts. Later that afternoon, around 3 p.m., I was walking back from the kitchen with a glass of water when I saw Mark again. He was at the far end of the archive hallway, standing in front of the door to Archive 3. He pulled the heavy door shut, and I heard the distinct, solid thud of it closing. He then took out a key, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a decisive, grating click. He gave the handle a hard, deliberate tug to make sure it was secure, and then, pocketing the key, he walked off down the main corridor without a single backward glance. His actions struck me as profoundly strange. Why would a storage room, a glorified junk closet, need to be locked so securely during the middle of a workday? It wasn't like it contained state secrets or bags of cash. It was full of useless electronic relics. My curiosity, already piqued from the day before, now flared into genuine suspicion. The tapping I'd heard, Ben's exhausted appearance, Mark's constant bullying, and now this. It felt like I was looking at a collection of puzzle pieces that were starting to form a very ugly picture. I waited until the hallway was clear, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I walked down the dim corridor, the silence amplifying the sound of my own footsteps. I reached the door to Archive 3 and hesitated for a moment. Then I placed my palm flat against the cool, gray metal of the door. It wasn't cool, it was warm, not just neutral. Temperature, room. Temperature warm, but noticeably, alarmingly hot. It felt like the heat was actively radiating from within the room, a low, steady bake. I pressed my hand harder against it, trying to understand what I was feeling. It was like touching the side of a computer tower that had been running for days on end, but the heat was distributed across the entire surface of the door. My blood ran cold. This was wrong, terribly wrong. That room was an interior space with no windows and, as far as I knew, no active machinery that could generate that kind of heat. The ventilation in that part of the building was notoriously poor. I tried the handle, my palm now slick with sweat. It was solid, unmoving. The lock was engaged. I knelt down, trying to peer through the tiny crack at the bottom, but I could see nothing but darkness. I stood up, my mind a whirlwind of terrible possibilities. For the rest of the day, I was completely useless at work. I couldn't focus on the documentary, on the beekeepers, on anything. My eyes kept darting down the hall toward that gray door. I replayed the sequence of events in my mind over and over, the tapping, Ben's pale, sweating face, Mark's cruel smirk, the locked door, the unnatural heat. There was no logical, innocent reason for that room to be so hot. There was no logical reason for Mark to be locking it from the outside, unless there was something, or someone, inside, and I had a sickening feeling I knew exactly who it was. The workday couldn't end fast enough. Every minute felt like an hour. I watched the clock, my anxiety coiling tighter and tighter in my stomach. I had to stay. I had to wait until the office emptied out, until I could go back to that door without being seen. I watched Mark pack up his briefcase at precisely 5:01 p.m., a creature of rigid, uncaring habit. He left without a word to anyone, the picture of a man untroubled by his conscience. One by one, my colleagues followed, their chatter about evening plans and the oppressive heat fading as the floor grew quiet. Finally, around 6:30 p.m., I was one of the last people left. The office was bathed in the long, orange glow of the setting sun, but the archive hallway remained in its perpetual twilight. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the servers and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I took a deep breath and walked back to Archive 3. The door was still radiating warmth, a silent testament to the oven-like conditions inside. I pressed my ear against it again, listening with an intensity I didn't know I possessed. This time, I heard something, a soft, shuffling sound, a faint, almost inaudible moan. It was the sound of human misery. My breath hitched. He was in there. Ben was in there. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. I had to get him out. I jiggled the handle again, more forcefully this time, but it was useless. I looked around for something to use, a tool, a paperclip, anything, but the hallway was sterile and empty. My mind raced through options, calling security. They would likely just call Mark at home, and he'd invent some plausible lie. Calling the police felt like a massive escalation that could backfire on Ben if I was wrong. I needed something more. I needed proof. I knelt down again, my eyes scanning the base of the door, desperate for any kind of clue, and that's when I saw it, a tiny corner of white, almost invisible against the gray floor. A small, folded piece of paper had been painstakingly pushed out from the tiny gap between the bottom of the door and the floorboards. My hands trembled as I carefully worked it free with my fingernail. It was a page torn from a small notepad, and it felt damp and limp in my fingers, saturated with what I could only assume was sweat. With a sense of profound dread, I unfolded it. The writing inside was shaky, the pencil strokes faint and uneven, as if written by a hand that could barely hold it steady, but the words were clear. Help, it's Ben. He took my phone. So hot in here. No water. Door is locked. Been here since morning. Since morning. A wave of cold fury washed over me, so intense it made my vision blur for a second. This wasn't just a cruel prank, or a thoughtless act of negligence. This was calculated. Mark had locked a young man in a sweltering, windowless storage room for an entire workday during a record-breaking heatwave without access to his phone or even a bottle of water. This was monstrous. This wasn't just mean, it was dangerous. People have died from heatstroke in less time, in less extreme conditions. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a clarity of purpose that cut through the panic. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I was a witness, and I had to do something. I carefully folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. It was my proof, my first piece of evidence. I knew in that moment that I couldn't just get him out. I had to make sure Mark Jenkins could never, ever do this to anyone again. My mission had changed. It wasn't just a rescue. It was about justice. My first priority was immediate, covert aid. Ben had been in that suffocating box for over 8 hours. He needed water desperately. Acting quickly, I went to the 24-hour convenience store across the street, my mind racing. I bought the 2 largest bottles of ice-cold water they had, along with a protein bar and a small electrolyte drink. Back in the deserted office, I knelt by the door to Archive 3. Ben, I whispered, my voice low and urgent. It's Gabriella from the editing bay. Can you hear me? A moment of silence, then a weak, raspy voice from the other side. Yes, Gabriella, thank you. I got your note. I said trying to keep my voice steady. I'm going to get you out, I promise. But I have to be smart about this so he can't hurt you later. For now, I have water for you. I scribbled a quick note on a fresh piece of paper. Got your note. Don't worry, I'm working on it. Water and a drink are coming under the door. Stay strong, we're going to get him. I pushed the note under first, followed by the protein bar. The bottles were too thick to fit, so I had to unscrew the caps and carefully slide them under on their sides, spilling a little on the floor, but managing to get most of the contents through to him. I heard him scrambling to get them, the sound of grateful, desperate gulping. It was a temporary fix, but it was something. I told him to hang on, that I would be back in the morning with a real plan. The next morning, I came in an hour earlier than usual, armed with a new sense of resolve. I needed to build a case, a fortress of evidence so undeniable that HR and management would have no choice but to act. I started by talking to a few colleagues I trusted, people who had been at the company for years. I approached them under the guise of being frustrated with Mark's management style. Does Mark seem even more on edge than usual to you? I asked Maria from accounting as we stood by the coffee machine. She rolled her eyes. Mark is perpetually on edge, but yeah, he's been a real piece of work with that new intern. I saw him make the poor kid restaple a 50-page report because he didn't like the angle of the staple. Who does that? Later, I spoke to Kevin, a graphic designer who sat near the archive hallway. I asked him if he'd noticed anything odd. Funny you should ask, he said, lowering his voice. I see him take that kid Ben back there all the time. Yesterday, I saw them go back around 9:30 a.m. Mark came out alone a few minutes later, didn't see the kid again all day. Figured he sent him on some ridiculous errand across town. Each conversation added a new layer to the picture. Mark's behavior wasn't a secret, it was an open secret. People saw it, they disliked it, but they were too afraid of his petty vindictiveness or too beaten down by corporate apathy to say anything. He had created a culture of fear around himself. My next stop was HR. I needed to gauge their likely reaction. I went to Sarah Chen, the HR representative, with a carefully crafted hypothetical scenario. Sarah was in her mid-30s, and she had a reputation for being a staunch defender of company policy, which often meant defending the company itself, not its employees. Hi, Sarah. I started, leaning against her cubicle wall with a friendly, casual air. Just a quick, weird question about office safety. Are there any specific regulations about using those old storage rooms as temporary workspaces? For, quiet focus or something. Sarah looked up from her computer, her expression neutral. That's an unusual question, Gabriella. There's no specific policy against it as long as the space meets standard OSHA requirements for ventilation, lighting, and egress. Why do you ask? Oh, no real reason, I said with a shrug, already backtracking. I just saw someone going into one of the old archive rooms the other day, and it got me thinking about how stuffy it is back there. Her non-committal, policy-driven answer told me everything I needed to know. Unless I came to her with a formal, documented complaint backed by irrefutable proof, they would treat it as hearsay. They would look into it, which was corporate. Speak for make it go away. I needed a smoking gun. That's when I remembered the security cameras. There was a camera mounted on the ceiling at the end of the main hallway, positioned to cover the emergency exit, but its dangle lens also had a clear, unobstructed view of the entrance to the archive corridor. If I could get that footage, I would have video proof of Mark walking into the hallway with Ben and walking out alone. I'd have a timestamp, I'd have the truth in high definition. Getting my hands on the security footage was the linchpin of my entire plan. I couldn't just request it. That would raise immediate red flags. I needed an inside man. My mind immediately went to David Chen, a network administrator in the IT department. David was a quiet, unassuming guy who spent most of his day in the chilly server room. We weren't close friends, but we'd had friendly chats in the break room about old sci-fi movies and the terrible quality of the office coffee. More importantly, I knew he had a deep and abiding dislike for Mark Jenkins, who frequently submitted condescending and technically illiterate IT support tickets. I found David in the break room, refilling his water bottle. I approached him cautiously, making sure no one else was within earshot. David, can I talk to you for a second? It's sensitive. He looked at me, his curiosity piqued. We moved to a quiet corner. I took a deep breath and laid it all out for him in a hushed, urgent whisper. I told him about the tapping, the hot door, and Ben's current situation. Then I took out the folded, sweat-stained note and showed it to him. David's eyes widened in horror as he read the shaky words. The professional detachment he usually wore vanished, replaced by genuine shock and anger. Are you serious? He breathed. Jenkins locked him in there, in Archive 3. That room's a death trap. The ventilation hasn't worked in years. He's still in there, David. I said, my voice tight. I need the footage from the camera at the end of the hall. The one pointed at the exit. I need to prove it. David didn't hesitate. Mark is a monster. Of course, I'll help. He explained that all camera footage was stored on a local server for 72 hours before being archived. He could access the server logs and pull the specific file, but he'd have to do it after hours when network activity was low and he was less likely to be monitored. "I'll have to remote in from home tonight," he said. "It's safer that way. I'll email you a secure link to the file by morning. Just be careful, Gabriella. This is serious." With the evidence being secured, my plan began to solidify. This couldn't just be about getting Ben out and getting Mark fired. It had to be a controlled demolition. I had to expose not just Mark, but the culture of apathy that allowed him to thrive. My plan now had 3 distinct phases. First, the liberation. Second, the official confrontation. Third, ensuring the fallout was permanent. For the liberation, I realized I didn't need a key. I needed a plausible, undeniable crisis that would force the door open. A direct confrontation would be my word against a supervisor's, but a building emergency, that was different. That would bring in neutral third-party witnesses. After work, I went down to the building's maintenance office in the basement. It was a cluttered, concrete room that smelled of oil and disinfectant. I found an old, grizzled janitor named Sal, who was reading a newspaper at his desk. I put on my most convincing, concerned employee face. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound worried but not hysterical. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was working late on the 4th floor, and I smell something really weird coming from the back hallway, near the old archive rooms. It smells like burning plastic or hot wires." Sal looked up at me over his reading glasses, his expression skeptical. "Probably just the servers. They run hot." And I don't think so. I insisted, using my skills as a storyteller to paint a picture of imminent danger. "It's a really acrid smell. I know the main servers are back there, and I'm just worried about a fire hazard." With this heat wave, you can't be too careful, right? The mention of a fire hazard did the trick. That was a liability he couldn't ignore. He grumbled, grabbed a large ring of master keys from a hook on the wall, and followed me upstairs. As we walked down the archive hallway, the smell of stale, superheated air was undeniable. I led him directly to Archive 3. Sal put his nose to the crack in the door, and his eyes widened. "Whoa, you're right, kid," he said, his skepticism gone. "Smells like an oven in there." He selected a key from his ring, inserted it into the lock, and turned. The click of the lock disengaging was the loudest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He pulled the heavy door open. The moment it swung inward, a wave of suffocating, stagnant heat blasted out of the room, so intense it was like opening a commercial dryer. And there, in the dim light from the hallway, was Ben. He was slumped against the back wall, his clothes completely drenched in sweat, his face pale and ashen. He looked up, his eyes dazed and disoriented, blinking against the sudden light. Liberation was complete. The sight of Ben, so clearly in distress, kicked both Sal and me into high gear. The janitor, now radiating pure, unadulterated fury, let out a string of curses directed at whoever was responsible. "What in God's name?" he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Together, we helped Ben to his feet. He was incredibly shaky, his legs unsteady. He leaned heavily on me as we guided him out of that suffocating box and into the relative coolness of the hallway. I gave him the fresh bottle of water I'd brought with me, and he drank it down in a few long, desperate swallows. We sat him down in a vacant office nearby, leaving the door open to let the air circulate. "I'm calling this in," Sal said, his voice a low growl. He pulled out a worn walkie-talkie from his belt. "This ain't just a hot room. This is a safety violation, a big one." He reported a hazardous and improperly used room. To building security, carefully detailing the extreme temperature and the fact that an employee had been inside. This was perfect. It created an official, time-stamped incident report, a formal paper trail completely independent of me or Ben. It was the first domino, and it had been pushed by a neutral, unimpeachable source. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find a secure email from David waiting in my inbox. The subject line was simply footage. Inside was a link to a password-protected video file. I downloaded it onto a flash drive, my hands shaking slightly. I watched it once. The video was clear as day. It showed Mark and Ben walking down the hall at 9:32 a.m. A few minutes later at 9:37 a.m., Mark emerged alone, pausing to deliberately lock the door to Archive 3 before walking away. The camera's timestamp was a silent, damning witness. Armed with the video, the janitor's report, Ben's testimony, and the sweat-stained note, I knew it was time. I found Ben at his new temporary desk, looking tired but resolute. I explained the evidence I had gathered. "Are you ready to do this?" I asked him. He nodded, his jaw set. "He can't get away with this." He said softly, "Together, We walked into Sarah Chen's HR office. We didn't ask for a meeting, we just appeared at her doorway. She looked up, surprised to see us. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm but carrying a weight of authority I didn't know I had. "We need to talk to you, right now." We sat down in the 2 chairs opposite her desk. I started from the beginning, laying out the events of the past 48 hours in a clear, chronological, and emotionless narrative. I told her about the tapping, the hot door, the note, my conversation with Sal the janitor, and the state we found Ben in. Ben then spoke, his voice quiet but steady, corroborating every detail and describing the terror and desperation he felt while locked in that room. Sarah listened, her expression shifting from professional detachment to mild concern. But I could still see the corporate calculus happening behind her eyes, weighing the severity of the claim against the disruption it would cause. "This is a very serious allegation," she said carefully when we had finished. A supervisor's word against an intern's can be difficult too. I didn't let her finish. I placed the small, blue flash drive on her desk and pushed it toward her. "It's not his word against Ben's," I said. "It's his word against a time-stamped video. Plug it in." The change in her demeanor was instantaneous. The mention of video evidence stripped away the corporate shield. She plugged the drive into her computer. We all sat in silence as she watched the footage. We saw her eyes widen as she saw Mark lock the door. We saw her lean closer to the screen, as if unable to believe it. We saw the color drain from her face as the reality of the situation. The sheer, calculated cruelty and the massive legal liability it represented for the company sank in. She watched it twice. Then she looked up, no longer at a difficult intern and a meddling employee, but at a victim and a key witness. The corporate nonchalance was gone, replaced by genuine shock and alarm. "I need to escalate this to senior management and legal immediately," she said, her voice suddenly crisp and efficient. "Please, don't speak to anyone else about this. We will handle it from here. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, both of you." The floodgates were open. The corporate machine, once kicked into motion, moved with terrifying speed and efficiency. With the janitor's official incident report, a formal HR complaint from a visibly distressed employee, and the undeniable, irrefutable video evidence, Mark Jenkins had nowhere to hide. His little kingdom of petty tyranny, built on fear and intimidation, crumbled in a matter of hours. He was called into a meeting with the head of our division, the director of HR, and a lawyer from the corporate legal team. We weren't privy to the details of that conversation, but we didn't need to be. Less than an hour later, we saw him walk out of the conference room. He wasn't escorted by security. The company was too image-conscious for such a public display, but he might as well have been. He walked stiffly, his face a mask of pale, stunned fury. He was carrying a small cardboard box filled with the sad trinkets of his desk, a framed photo, a coffee mug, a stupid motivational paperweight. He refused to look at anyone, his eyes fixed on the floor as he made the long, silent walk of shame to the elevators. He was fired on the spot for gross misconduct, endangering an employee, and creating a hostile work environment. The company immediately shifted into damage control mode. An all-staff memo was sent out by the end of the day. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, vaguely mentioning a safety incident that had been addressed swiftly, and reminding everyone of the company's unwavering commitment to a safe, respectful, and professional work environment. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew exactly what it was about. The story had already spread through the office grapevine like wildfire. In the following days, the changes were palpable. The door to Archive 3 was removed from its hinges, and a team of contractors was brought in to properly decommission all the old storage rooms, ensuring they were properly ventilated and fitted with safety releases that couldn't be locked from the outside. Ben was given the rest of the week off with full pay. The company offered him access to counseling services, which he accepted. When he returned, he was quietly reassigned to the marketing department, under a manager who was widely known for her kindness and genuine passion for mentorship. The change in him was remarkable. Within a few weeks, the haunted, anxious look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. He started speaking up in meetings, contributing ideas. He was finally being treated like a valued team member, not a personal servant. He stopped by my desk a few weeks later. "Gabriella, I don't think I ever properly thanked you," he said, his gratitude genuine and heartfelt. "I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. You saved me." "You don't have to thank me, Ben," I told him. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, he said, shaking his head. They wouldn't have. Everyone saw how he was, but you were the only one who did something. Thank you. His parents even sent me a beautiful thank you card, expressing their profound gratitude for my looking out for their son. As for me, there was no formal recognition, no promotion or bonus. In fact, for a few days, I felt a certain chill from upper management, the subtle disapproval reserved for those who rock the boat, even for the right reasons, but that soon faded, replaced by something far more valuable, the quiet, earned respect of my colleagues. People started looking me in the eye, smiling genuine smiles. The atmosphere in the office, which had been thick with a low-grade tension under Mark, began to lighten. People were less afraid, more collaborative. It turned out that removing a single toxic element could change the entire ecosystem. I went back to my editing bay, back to my stories of urban beekeepers and other people's lives, but I felt different. I had learned that sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones you find in the footage. They're the ones that demand you step out from behind the screen, listen for the faint, desperate tapping through the walls, and do the right thing.